The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise today on behalf of the constituents of Oshawa to speak to Bill S-224, a nonpartisan bill which aims to further solidify the concept of exploitation for the purpose of establishing whether a person has committed the offence of trafficking in persons and to remove the unfair burden placed on exploited individuals to prove there was an element of fear in their abuse. Before arriving to the stage of consideration in committee, Bill S-224 was introduced in the Senate and was eventually passed unanimously in the Senate on October the 6th, 2022. I then had the immense distinction as a Member of Parliament to sponsor and introduce this important bill for the first time here in the House of Commons 2 weeks later. I'd like to take a moment to thank Senator Tulogen for her collaborative effort and wonderful success in getting the bill through the Senate, a success I hope to share here in the House of Commons. I'd also like to thank the member for Peace River Westlock for his unwavering support throughout this process and as well for his unending commitment to end human trafficking. Furthermore, I want to thank the amazing community of supporters, victims, mums and dads, survivors, and workers. These individuals and many more like them have shown a dedication and servitude in making a difference in the lives of the vulnerable victims in everyone's communities. These people are real heroes, Mr. Speaker, and they are saving lives with the work which they do and they're undertaking and they are accomplishing. When a Member of Parliament has the opportunity to bring both houses together for a common cause, it is truly an honour, especially for a bill that represents a small change that will make a big difference in the lives of so many vulnerable people. People denied justice, people denied their human dignity. Unfortunately, when Bill S-224 was considered in the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, the bill saw a fatal outcome. The vital contents within it were completely gutted at committee, leaving the bill to just one page. By leaving the bill empty and instead of passing any improved amendments, there has been a failure to solidify the concept of exploitation for the purposes of establishing whether a person has committed the offence of trafficking in persons, as well as removing the unfair burden placed on exploited individuals to prove that there was an element of fear in their abuse. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a couple of minutes now to discuss in-depth review of the importance behind the original contents of Bill S-224. This modern-day slavery initiative was first brought to my attention by Darla, a survivor friend and one of my constituents, and I'd like to thank her for sharing her story with me. As a father, her story motivated me to look for real solutions to the problem. At its heart, Bill S-224 aims to align the Canadian Criminal Code's definition of trafficking in persons with that of the 2000 Palermo Protocol. Importantly, this would remove the unfair burden placed on exploited individuals who, under the current Canadian law, must prove that there was an element of fear in their abuse in order to obtain a conviction in court. When a crime is committed, there's no debate whether or not the acts have occurred. Yet under Canadian law, the victim is required to prove fear in order for a conviction to occur. The absurdity of the situation is unmatched. An offender could get released even if there was proof of the crime, but the victim was unable to prove fear. I say, why do we treat this particular crime so differently when it comes to exploitation and human trafficking? Mr. Speaker, that's backwards. Instead, we need to make the focus on the perpetrator's actions, the person who actually committed the crime, and not force a victim to prove an emotion, in this case, fear. Something needs to change, as this is not justice, and in turn, this is not how the Canadian justice system should function. Human trafficking, Mr. Speaker, is a plague, mostly on vulnerable young people and their families across Canada, in my area and in yours. I was hopeful since I first sponsored and introduced Bill S-224 in this House that my colleagues, regardless of their political stripe, would help me secure this long overdue change to Canada's criminal code. Human trafficking does not discriminate, and my goal is to ensure that our country and local communities are safer for our most vulnerable young people. These vulnerable young people often think of their abusers as their friend, that their abuser cares for them, loves them. Those of us not involved in human trafficking can see that this is not the case. We see the coercion, manipulation, and lies. We owe these victims justice. Often the Crown's case depends on the victim's testimony, the only evidence against the trafficker. Without the victim's testimony, there is no case. In Canada, sometimes it takes years to come to court. There, the victims can be victimized again and again. We have heard from experts that victims often deceive and portray themselves within their own perception as not being victims. We need to take serious and effective action to ensure that victims come forward and guarantee that they will not be repeatedly victimized. Mr. Speaker, I once again raise the dispute within this House whether or not the crime of human trafficking has occurred should only be defined by the perpetrator's actions rather than the victim's experience. Victims should not be re-victimized by a system. We owe it to victims to make this small change that will make such a huge difference. By amending the criminal code to reflect the international definition of trafficking in persons as outlined in the Palermo Protocol, we enable the Crown to efficiently convict human traffickers. The Palermo Protocol was adopted, Mr. Speaker, in November of 2000 at the 55th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. It has 117 signatories, including Canada. Human trafficking is defined as the act of recruiting, transporting, harboring, and receiving a person by means of coercion, abuse of power, or deception for the purpose of exploitation. More than 24 years have passed, Mr. Speaker, yet this small but important change is still not reflected in our criminal code. Colleagues, let's not continue to make this another example of Canada's promises that never see concrete action. This is about protecting vulnerable Canadians from predators who exploit their victims for personal gain. And sadly, that gain is becoming greater and much more lucrative. Mr. Speaker, human trafficking generates more than $32 billion annually and abuses over 40 million victims each year. Unfortunately, it is seen as a low-risk criminal activity here in Canada with a very high reward. According to StatsCan, less than 8% of perpetrators charged with human trafficking have been prosecuted. Think about that and consider this. Very few perpetrators are even charged. One witness felt we no longer needed the bill due to the Ontario provincial rulings. However, we see even with these provincial rulings, conviction rates remain shamefully low, which is why we need to restore this bill and pass it here in the House. We can do better, Mr. Speaker, and we must do better. I stand here today for Darla and for Oshawa and countless other human trafficking survivors. I invite all members here to stand with me, and I'm hoping that every member in this House still continues to support this initiative. Colleagues, I stand here for those who are being exploited tonight, right now in plain sight, some right outside my office doors in downtown Oshawa. Mr. Speaker, this doesn't end at my doorstep. Each member in this House of Commons can be sure this is happening right outside each of their doorsteps as well. My colleague from Peace River, Westlock, has a statistic and a quote that puts things into perspective. This crime of human trafficking is happening today within 10 blocks or 10 minutes from your home. Human trafficking is on the rise, and it relies on abuse, coercion, and manipulation. As I've said, victims are often convinced that their traffickers are their friends or their boyfriends. Mr. Speaker, traffickers have made promises of clothes, money, work, drugs, education, and even protection. Many victims truly and naively believe that their trafficker have their best interests at heart. Traffickers prey upon the most vulnerable for a reason, as they also resort to violence and threats to make them do what they're told. They seek out young people dealing with substance abuse, traumas, addictions, abuse, or homelessness. Women and girls, Indigenous children, new immigrants, persons living with disability, LGBTQ2+, and migrant workers are among the most at-risk groups. How can we continue to put so much responsibility upon these victims who have endured such unimaginable atrocities? If we do not amend the criminal code, Mr. Speaker, these cases depend upon the victim's ability to perform on the witness stand. Remember, this is the same victim who we just described as being vulnerable to gaslighting and manipulation. Some of these victims do not have the strength to fight our current system. They do not have the strength to stand up against slick lawyers and a system stacked against them. Mr. Speaker, this is not justice, and it usually results in charges being dropped. We need to give victims every tool possible that is available to allow the return of both their dignity and their humanity. The goal of Bill S-224 has been to implement a simple amendment to the criminal code, a very small modification that will make a huge difference in the ability of the Crown to prosecute human traffickers. No more settling for an 8% prosecution rate. To Darla, to the mums, the dads, the victims, the wonderful Canadians who have dedicated their life to ending human trafficking, this small change can happen, and the opportunity for us to come together and end this horrendous crime must not be lost. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank the honourable member from Oshawa.